Hey guys, welcome back to the channel Dream Through History. Have you ever wondered what life was really like in medieval Japan? Not the world of samurai battles or dramatic legends, but the quiet daily grind of ordinary people. Imagine a place where rice was money, where your job and even your dinner depended entirely on your social class, where nights were cold, candles dim, and prayer as common as breathing. In this video, we'll explore the often overlooked rhythms of life in feudal Japan, from the rigid class structure to the humble food that filled the bellies of farmers, to how people slept, prayed, and worked. This is a journey into a world of tradition, hardship, and silent beauty. So lie back, let the sounds of another century carry you to sleep. Welcome to the daily life of medieval Japan. Imagine waking before dawn in a small village under the watchful gaze of a distant castle. You walk barefoot across wooden floors, stepping into rice fields shimmering in early morning mist. This is feudal Japan, an era of samurai, peasants, monks, and merchants, all bound by rigid class and code. Daily life in medieval Japan. Daily life in medieval Japan. Daily life in medieval Japan 1185 to 1606 CE was, for most people, the age-old struggle to put food on the table, build a family, stay healthy, and try to enjoy the finer things in life whenever possible. The upper classes had better and more colorful clothes, used expensive foreign porcelain, were entertained by no theater, and could afford to travel to other parts of Japan, while the lower classes had to make do with plain cotton, ate rice and fish, and were mostly preoccupied with surviving the occasional famine, outbreaks of disease, and the civil wars that blighted the country. Still, many of the cultural pursuits of medieval Japan continue to thrive today, from drinking green tea to playing the Go board game, from owning a fine pair of chopsticks to remembering ancestors every July, August in the Obon festival. Society. Japanese medieval society was divided into classes based on their economic function. At the top was the warrior class of samurai or bushi, which had its own internal distinctions based on the feudal relationship between lord and vassal. The landowning aristocrats, priests, farmers, and peasants who paid a land tax to the landowners, or the state, artisans and merchants. Curiously, the merchants were considered socially inferior to farmers in the medieval period. There were, too, a number of social outcasts, which included those who worked in messy or undesirable professions like butchers and tanners, actors, undertakers, and criminals. There was some movement between the classes, such as peasants becoming warriors, especially during the frequent civil wars of the period, but there were also legal barriers to a member of one class marrying a member of another. Although women were not given the advantages awarded to men, their status and rights changed through the medieval period and often depended on both the status of their husbands and the region in which they lived. Rights related to inheritance, property ownership, divorce, and freedom of movement all fluctuated over time and place. A common strategy of families everywhere, and of all classes, was to use daughters as a tool to marry into a higher status family and so improve the position of her own relations. Another strategy was for powerful samurai to use their daughters as a means to solidify alliances with rival warlords by arranging marriages of convenience for them. Marriage was a more formal affair amongst the upper classes, while in rural communities things were more relaxed. Even premarital sex was permitted thanks to the established tradition of yohei or night visit between lovers. In ancient Japan, a married man often went to live in the family home of his wife, but in the medieval period this was reversed. In the case of the wives of samurai, They were expected to defend the home in their husband's absence on campaign, and they were given the gift of a knife at their wedding as a symbol of this duty. Many such women did learn martial skills. Divorce was always in favor of the male who could decide to terminate his marriage simply by writing a letter to his wife. If the couple remained on amicable terms, then a mutual settlement could be made, but the male ultimately had the power to decide such matters. If there were evidence of adultery, then the wife could even be executed. As a wife had no recourse to any legal protection, the only option for many women to escape adulterous or violent husbands was to join a convent. The family, the essential family unit in Japan, was the IE house, which included parents and their children, grandparents, other blood relations, and the household servants and their children. Eldest sons usually inherited the property of the IE, but the absence of male offspring could entail bringing in an outsider to act as head of the family. Koshu male children were often adopted for this very purpose, although a female member might also take on the role. The wife of the Koshu was the senior female in the family and was responsible for managing the household duties. The good of the IE was meant to take precedence over any individuals, and the three principles to be followed by all were obligation, obedience, and loyalty. For this reason, all the property within a family was regarded not as belonging to any individual, but to the IE as a whole. Filial duty oyakoko to one's parents and grandparents was especially cultivated as a positive sentiment. Education, that children of farmers and artisans were taught by their fathers and mothers the practical skills they had acquired through a lifetime of work. Regarding more formal education, this had previously been the exclusive privilege of aristocratic families or those who joined Buddhist monasteries. But in the medieval period, the rising samurai class began to educate their children, too, largely at the schools offered by Buddhist temples. Nevertheless, the number of people who were literate, even in the upper classes, was only a tiny proportion of the population as a whole, and monks were much called on to assist with paperwork in the secular world. When they did learn, children in the early medieval period did so from private tutors or the classes arranged by temples. But there was at least one famous school in the modern sense, the Ashikaga school, founded by the samurai Uesugi Norizane in 1439 CE, and boasting 3,000 students by the mid-16th century CE. Here, boys learnt the two subjects close to every warrior's heart: military strategy and Confucian philosophy. Many prosperous samurai also established libraries of classic Chinese and Japanese literature, which were made accessible to priests and scholars, and these often became noted centers of learning in the Edo period 1603 to 1868 CE. One famous example was the Konozawa Library, established by Hojo Sanetoki in 1275 CE. Another source of education was the schools established by Christian missionaries from the 16th century CE. Shopping markets developed in Japan from the 14th century CE, so that most towns had a weekly or thrice-monthly one. When merchants traveled around their particular regions and farmers sold their surplus goods, foodstuffs were more available than ever before, increasing thanks to developments in agricultural techniques and tools. Goods were bartered for other goods, and coins were being used more and more, although they were actually imported from China. Markets were also promoted by local authorities, who saw their value as a tax revenue source by standardizing currencies, weights, and measures. Non-food items available at local markets included pottery, tools, cooking utensils, and household furniture. Markets at the capital and other larger cities might have more exotic goods on sale, such as Ming porcelain, Chinese silk, Korean cotton, and ginseng. Spices from Thailand and Indonesia or Japanese-made jewelry and weapons. Meals in the medieval period. Most upper-class Japanese and monks would have eaten 2 meals a day, one around noon and another in the early evening. Lower classes might have eaten 4 meals a day. Men generally ate separately from women, and there were certain rules of etiquette, such as a wife should serve a husband and the eldest. Daughter-in-law should serve the female head of the household. Food was served on a tray placed in front of the diner, who was seated on the floor. The food was then eaten with chopsticks made of lacquered wood. Precious metal or ivory. The influence of Buddhism on the aristocracy was strong, and meant that meat was at least publicly frowned upon by many. The samurai and lower classes had no such qualms and consumed meat whenever they could afford to. The staple foods for everyone were rice and lots of it. 3 portions per person per meal was not uncommon. Vegetables, seaweed, seafood, and fruit, soybean sauce and paste were popular to give extra taste, as were wasabi, a type of horseradish, sansho, ground seed pods of the prickly ash tree, and ginger. Green tea was drunk, usually served after the food, but this was brewed from rough leaves, and so different from the fine powder used in the Japanese tea ceremony. Sake or rice wine was drunk by everyone, but was reserved for special occasions in the medieval period. Clothing. Upper-class women wore perhaps the most famous wardrobe item from Japanese culture, the kimono, meaning literally thing to wear. The kimono is a woven silk robe tied at the waist by a broad band or obi. Other clothes for both men and women of means tended to be silk, long and loose-fitting, and both sexes might wear baggy trousers, and women's skirt trousers, too. Women might wear a long robe with a train, the uchiki, while men wore short jackets called haori, or the long jacket, uchikaki, or kadori, fashionable from the Muromachi period. 1333 to 1573 CE, from the Azuchi Momoyama period 1568, 73rds, to 1600 CE. Men, especially samurai, often wore a matching sleeveless robe and trousers outfit called the kamishomo. Finer clothes were often beautifully embroidered with designs of plants, flowers, birds, and landscapes, which would become even more elaborate in the Edo period. Lower classes typically wore similar clothes, but of more sober coloring and made of woven flax or hemp, and, if working in the fields in summer, both men and women often only wore a loincloth-type garment and nothing else. From the late 14th century CE, cotton clothing became much more common for all classes. The preferred footwear for everyone was sandals zori, made from either wood, rope, or leather. Country folk might wear straw boots, zund, in colder weather. The most common headgear was the kasa, a straw hat which took many forms, some of which indicated the wearer's social status. A popular accessory for men and women was a hand fan, uchi, and specifically the folding fan ogi, which became a status symbol. Women might wear an ornate comb or pin in their hair made from bamboo, wood, ivory, or tortoise shell, and perhaps decorated with a few embellishments in gold or pearl. A pale complexion was admired on both men and women, and so white powder oshiroi was worn. Fashionable women wore a red dot on their lower lip made using a flour-based paste, or a red lipstick bani. Women also shaved and redrew their eyebrows. Women and samurai were inclined to blacken their teeth in the medieval period in the process known as oh, although tattoos became fashionable in the 18th century CE. In medieval times they were used as a form of punishment for criminals, the actual crime being written on the face and arms for all to see. Entertainment. Medieval entertainments included sumo wrestling bouts, held at Shinto shrines before it gained a wider appeal in its own venues from the Edo period. Falconry, fishing, cockfighting, a type of football game kamari, where players had to keep the ball in the air as it went around a circle playing area. Handball, tamari, badminton, hanatsuki, which used wooden paddles, and martial arts, especially those involving horse riding, fencing, and archery, were popular pastimes. Indoor games included the two most popular board games, Go and Shogi. The game of Go involves two players aiming to move white or black stones across a grid board in order to control territory, while Shogi is a form of chess. Cards were also played, although they were quite different to those in the West, with two popular sets having poems on them, karuta or flowers, and animals. The gambling was frequently associated with card playing. From the 14th century CE, no theatre was another popular form of entertainment where masked actors performed in stylized movements set to music, telling the stories of celebrated gods, heroes, and heroines. Children played with the traditional toys popular elsewhere, such as spinning tops, dolls, and kites. Travel was restricted in the medieval period because of Japan's mountainous terrain and the lack of a well-kept road network. One group that did move around was pilgrims. Although these were limited to those with either the means to pay for expensive travel arrangements or the time to do so, there were specific pilgrimage routes, such as the 88 Temple Tour established by the monk Kukai 774 to 835 CE, and the 33 Temple Tour, which worshippers of the Bodhisattva canon were encouraged to endure. Up to the Edo period, getting around was mostly done on foot, with goods carried by teams of horses or oxen pulling carts, while faster horses were ridden by messengers. Waterways were an important means to transport both people and goods, especially timber, cotton, cloth, rice, and fish. The wealthy were carried about on a palanquin cargo, a bamboo or wooden chair between long poles for the two carriers, one at either end. For the more adventurous, there was maritime trade with both China and Korea, and monks, especially, traveled back and forth to study and bring ideas back to their monasteries. Both land and sea travel remained dangerous in medieval Japan, the former thanks to bandits, and the latter due to the wacko pirates that plagued the high seas. Death and funerals, just as Japanese people today enjoy one of the longest life expectancy rates in the world, so too in the medieval period, the Japanese were ahead of almost everyone else. The average life expectancy was around 50 years of age in the best locations and periods, compared to a high of 40 in Western Europe, for example. There remained challenges to overcome or avoid, such as famine, vitamin deficiency from a rice-heavy diet, diseases such as smallpox and leprosy, illness caused by parasites which thrived in conditions where waste disposal was poor, and the risk of death or injury from wars. In the medieval period, the most common treatment of the dead was cremation kaso. When a person died, most Japanese thought that the spirit of the deceased then went to the land of darkness or Shigo no Tsukai. The spirits then might occasionally revisit the world of the living. Those who followed Buddhism believed that people either went to a form of hell or were reincarnated or went to the Buddhist paradise. The Pure Land ancestors were not forgotten and were honored each year in the Obon festival held in July-August, when it was thought they returned to their families for a 3-day visit in this world. Society was layered. At the top lived samurai and aristocrats warriors, who also held bureaucratic power. Below them were peasants, who grew the rice that grounded the entire economy. Merchants and artisans lived in towns, often regarded as lower status, despite their wealth. Edo society. Edo society refers to the society of Japan under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate During the Edo period, from 1603 to 1868, Edo society was a feudal society with strict social stratification, customs, and regulations intended to promote political stability. The Emperor of Japan and the Kuige were the official ruling class of Japan but had no power. The shogun of the Tokugawa clan, the daimyo, and their retainers of the samurai class administered Japan through their system of domains. The majority of Edo society were commoners divided into peasant, craftsman, and merchant classes, and various untouchable or burakumin groups. The Tokugawa shogunate ruled by dividing the people into four main categories. Older scholars believed that there were shino kesachi, shino gongshang, for occupations of samurai, peasants, hayakusho, craftsmen, and merchants, chunin, under the daimyo, with 80% of peasants under the 5% samurai class, followed by craftsmen and merchants. However, various studies have revealed since about 1995 that the classes of peasants, craftsmen, and merchants under the samurai are equal, and the old hierarchy chart has been removed from Japanese history textbooks. In other words, peasants, craftsmen, and merchants are not a social pecking order, but a social classification. The Bakumatsu from 1853 on lead to growing opposition to the Edo system, and it was dismantled after the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Historical context, feudalism, social stratification, and explicit, fine-grained ranking of people existed in Japan long before the Edo period, beginning with attempts as far back as the Taika reforms in 645 AD, initiating the Retsuro legal system that was modeled from Chinese Tang Dynasty legal code. The reforms were following a major and devastating coup d'etat attempt by Soga no Emishi, with the events not only exterminating entire clans, but tearing apart a gaping hole in the Japanese indigenous religion Kyo-Shinto, paving the way for a Buddhist Shinto syncretism of religion. The Taika reforms were the legal glue deemed necessary to thwart future coup d'etat attempts, and the Retsuro system led to the formation of castes in Japan. Nevertheless, frequent warfare and political instability plagued Japan in following centuries, providing countless opportunities to usurp, bend, and mobilize positions within social ranks. Even the ranks themselves, especially military ranks, became more respected if only out of necessity. Confucian ideas from China also provided the foundation for a system of strict social prescriptions. Along with political twists and turns of the day, the Ashikaga shogunate established a loose class system when it ruled Japan as a feudal shogunate. During the Muromachi period from 1338 to 1573, the final collapse of the Ashikaga worsened the effects of the Sengoku period or Age of Warring States, the state of social upheaval and near-constant civil war in Japan since 1467. Tokugawa Ieyasu of the Tokugawa clan and his eastern army emerged victorious after the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, defeating the western army of Toyotomi Hidori, ending the Sengoku civil wars. Ieyasu founded the Tokugawa shogunate as a new feudal government of Japan with himself as the shogun. However, Ieyasu was especially wary of social mobility given that Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of his peers and a Kampaku imperial regent whom he replaced, was born into a low caste and rose to become Japan's most powerful political figure of the time. The Tokugawa clan sought to eradicate any potential opposition across Japanese society from top to bottom. To consolidate their rule, the Emperor of Japan was the official ruler of Japan at the very top of the Tokugawa class hierarchy. However, the Emperor was only a de jure ruler, functioning as a figurehead held up as the ultimate source of political sanction for the shogun's authority. The emperor and his imperial court, located in Kyoto, the official capital of Japan, were given virtually no political power, but their prestige was invincible. The court nobility, the kugage, were the civil aristocracy of Japan. Similar to the emperor, the kugage were incredibly prestigious and held significant influence in cultural fields, but wielded very little political power and served functions only for symbolic purposes. Shogun was the de facto ruler of Japan, officially. The shogun was a title for a prominent military general of the samurai class, appointed by the emperor with the task of national administration. Successive shoguns held the highest or near highest court ranks, higher than most court nobles. They were made Shnihl senior, second rank, of court rank, upon assuming office. Then Ru Ichi I Tong Iwei junior, first rank, and the highest rank of Shhei Jung Iwei, senior first rank, was conferred upon them upon their death. In reality, the shogun was a military dictator with only a nominal appointment from the emperor, who held the ultimate political power in Japan, controlling foreign policy, the military, and feudal patronage. The shogun was a hereditary position held by members of the Tokugawa clan, who were direct descendants of Tokugawa Ieyasu. The shogun was based in the Tokugawa capital city of Edo Musashi Province, located 370 kilometers, 230 miles east of Kyoto in the Kanto region, and ruled Japan with his government, the Bakufu. The Tokugawa shogunate established that the court ranks granted to daimyo by the imperial court were based on the recommendation of the Tokugawa shogunate, and the court ranks were used to control the daimyo. Daimyo were samurai feudal lords. The daimyo were high-ranking members of the samurai, and, similar to the shogun, held most of the real political power in Japan. The daimyo was responsible for administration through their large personal domains, the hon, which served as unofficial administrative divisions in tandem with the legal provinces. A daimyo was determined if a samurai's domain was assessed at 10,000 koku, 50,000 bushels, or more under the Tokugawa kokudaka system of taxation. The daimyo held significant autonomy, but the Tokugawa policy of Sankankeitai required them to alternate living in Edo and their domain every year. The daimyo were separated into the Shinpan relatives of the Tokugawa, the Feudal daimyo, who filled the ranks of the Tokugawa administration, and the Tozama daimyo, those who only submitted to the Tokugawa after the Battle of Sekigahara. 4. Classes. The Tokugawa government intentionally created a social order called the Four Divisions of Society Shinakoshiko that would stabilize the country. The new four classes were based on ideas of Confucianism that spread to Japan from China, and were not arranged by wealth or capital, but by what philosophers described as their moral purity. By this system, the non-aristocratic remainder of Japanese society was composed of samurai, shi, farming peasants, non, artisans, gong, and merchants. Shung, sh. 7 samurai were placed at the top of society because they started an order and set a high moral example for others to follow. The system was meant to reinforce their position of power in society by justifying their ruling status. However, the Shinakoshiko does not accurately describe Tokugawa society as Buddhist and Shinto priests. The kugage, outside of the imperial court, and outcast classes were not included in this description of hierarchy. 7. In some cases, a poor samurai could be little better off than a peasant, and the lines between the classes could blur, especially between artisans and merchants in urban areas. Still, The theory provided grounds for restricting privileges and responsibilities to different classes, and it gave a sense of order to society. In practice, solidified social relationships, in general, helped create the political stability that defined the Edo period. 135–136. Samurai had the right to strike and even kill with their sword anyone of a lower class who compromised their honor. Samurai were the noble warrior class in Japan. The samurai constituted about 10% of the population and functioned as soldiers in the employment of a lord in a master-warrior feudal relationship. Other classes were prohibited from possessing longswords such as the tachi or katana, and carrying both a longsword and a short sword became the symbol of the samurai class. However, their services were in limited demand, as the Edo period was largely free from both external threats and internal conflicts. Instead, the samurai maintained their fighting skills more as an art form than to fight. Samurai were paid a stipend from their lord, limiting their ties to the economic base. In addition, samurai could not own land, which would have given them income independent from their duty. Samurai generally lived around their daimyo's castle, creating a thriving town or city environment around the middle of a domain. There were social stratifications within the samurai class. Upper-level samurai had direct access to their daimyo and could hold his most trusted positions, with some achieving a level of wealth that allowed them to retain their own samurai vassals. Mid-level samurai held military and bureaucratic positions and had some interactions with their daimyo if needed. Low-level samurai could be paid as little as a subsistence wage and worked as guards, messengers and clerks. Positions within the samurai class were largely hereditary and talented. Individuals could not rise above a few social steps beyond their birth. Peasants, according to Confucian philosophy, society could not survive without agriculture. 45 Life for rural peasants focused on farming in and around their villages. Peasants rarely moved beyond their villages, and journeys and pilgrimages required a permit. But young people occasionally sought seasonal employment outside of their village. As a result, people were highly suspicious of outsiders. Social bonding, critical to the survival of the whole village, was also reinforced through seasonal festivals. Villages were highly collective. There were strong pressures to conform and no room to deviate from custom. 12 Though there were conflicts, they were seen as disruptive to the village and order and were to be limited as much as possible. 13 The peasant class owned land, but rights to tax this land were given to the local daimyo. Peasants worked to produce enough food for themselves and still meet the tax burden. Most agriculture during this time was cultivated by families on their own land, in contrast to the plantation or hacienda model implemented elsewhere. 45 Peasants could amass relatively large amounts of wealth, but remained in the same class because of their association with the land. Wealthier families, and those that held their own land and paid taxes, were held in much higher regard and had more political influence in village matters. However, the survival of the village depended on every household cooperating to meet the tax burden and overcome natural disasters, such as famines. During the reign of the third shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu, farmers were not allowed to eat any of the rice they grew. They had to hand it all over to their daimyo, and then wait for him to give some back, as charity artisans typically lived in urban areas, and by 1800, as much as 10% of the population of Japan may have lived in large urban areas, one of the highest levels in the world at the time. 43 The daimyo and their samurai did not produce any goods themselves, but they used the tax surplus from the land to fuel their consumption. Their needs were met by artisans, who moved to be around the castles and were restricted to living in their own quarter. Merchants grew increasingly powerful during the Edo period. In spite of their social standing, and the top merchants commanded a certain amount of respect, with Osaka and later Edo having concentrations of the merchant class. Wealthy merchant houses arose to organize distributors and hold legal monopolies. As their wealth grew, merchants wanted to consume and display their wealth in the same manner as the samurai, but laws prevented them from doing so overtly. Still, their consumption, combined with that of the samurai, served to reinforce the growth of the merchant and artisan classes. Untouchables underneath the merchant class were various communities and levels of outcasts not included within the official Tokugawa class system. These people were untouchables who fell outside of mainstream Japanese society for one reason or another, and were actively discriminated against at the societal level. Burakumin, hamlet people, village people, or those who live in hamlets villages, were ethnic Japanese people whose occupations were considered impure or tainted by death, such as executioners, undertakers, slaughterhouse workers, butchers, and tanners. These occupations were seen to be kagari, defilement in the Shinto religion. In the Edo period, the social stigma of being a burakumin developed into a hereditary status. Although technically commoners, the burakumin were victims of severe ostracism and lived in their own isolated villages or ghettos away from the rest of the population. Ethnic minorities in Japan were generally excluded from the class system, though certain individuals in service of the shogun or daimyo were included. The Tokugawa isolationist policy of Sakoku banned most foreigners from entering Japan. Role of women. A Japanese woman's life varied immensely according to her family's social status. Women in samurai families were expected to submit to their male heads of household, but as they aged, they could become the ranking household member if their husband died. Children were taught to respect both of their parents, even as adults. Women from the lower classes were much less restricted by social expectations and could play an integral part in the family's business. 15. Peasant. Women were expected to do household chores in the early morning before working in the fields with their male relatives and, regardless of age, were important. Working members of their families. Marriage was not based on romantic attraction. Families tried to use marriage as a way to increase their social standing or, among wealthier groups, to increase one's influence and holdings. Most often, however, marriage occurred between two families of equal status. 14. Female virginity. At marriage was important in the samurai classes. It was much less important to the lower classes. 14. After marriage. Women were restricted from taking additional sexual partners. Males of the upper classes, however, were able to take concubines and have relations with unmarried women. Divorce was common, and a woman from a poor household could very easily leave her husband and return to her original family. Decline. The foundation of Edo society was its stable social order, but changes to Japanese society over the next 2 centuries began to challenge the Tokugawa system. Increasing urbanization and rising consumerism saw wealth become concentrated outside of the samurai class, and their fixed stipends did not increase despite the rising cost of commodities. The increasingly burdensome cost of proper social etiquette led many samurai to become indebted to wealthy urban merchant families. The merchants, in turn, were restricted from showing their wealth for fear of violating the laws that restricted privileges to the samurai class. That created deepening resentment but also increasing interdependence between the two classes. 159. Some Japanese scholars began to question the Confucian beliefs that provided the foundation of Edo society. 57. Additionally, numerous changes in rural areas increasingly challenged the Tokugawa system. New technology, which increased productivity, allowed some peasant families to produce a surplus of food, creating a disposable income that could be used to support ventures beyond farming. Some peasants also became indebted to their wealthier neighbors, and more families lost ownership of their land. This sparked resentment that sometimes erupted into violence towards landlords and the village elite. In 1853, the beginning of the Bakumatsu saw Edo society increasingly questioned by Japanese people when Western powers used their technological superiority to force concessions from the Tokugawa in the unequal treaties. Many Japanese people, including members of the samurai, began to blame the Tokugawa for Japan's backwardness and subsequent humiliation. A modernization movement which advocated the abolition of feudalism and return of power to the imperial court eventually overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate in the Meiji Restoration in 1868. The new Meiji government of the Empire of Japan soon abolished the Tokugawa class system that had characterized Edo society. The Kugi and daimyo classes were merged into the Kozoku aristocratic class, with class privileges which formed the Meiji oligarchy. Most remaining samurai that did not become Kozoku were designated as Shizoku, a distinct class without class privileges. That was purely a title on the government register. Commoners and the Burakumen were merged into a single commoner class without restrictions or distinction for their occupation. Though Burakumen continued to face discrimination similar to Edo society. Rice was more than food, it was currency. Power was measured in koku, a unit representing enough rice to feed one person for a year. Farmers paid taxes in rice, supporting their local daimyo lords and fueling visits from wandering samurai. Economics of Feudal Japan from Wikipedia. The Free Encyclopedia in Feudal Japan between 1185 CE and 1868 CE. Citation needed. Vassals offered their loyalty and services, military or other, to a landlord in exchange for access to a portion of land and its harvest. In such a system, political power is diverted from a central monarch and control is divided up amongst wealthy landowners and warlords. The initial widespread practice of feudalism in Japan coincided with the instatement of the first shogun, Minamoto no Yoritomo, who acted as the de facto ruler of Japan over the Japanese emperor. At the same time, the warrior class samurai gained political power that previously belonged to the aristocratic nobility Kugage. The shogunates distributed estates shewn to loyal subjects, the most powerful of whom became daimyo, or governors of vast landmasses who often had private armies. Unlike in medieval European feudalism, the supervisors of the land, known as gittos, stewards, and shugos, constables, did not initially own the land themselves, which remained under the shogunate's control. The daimyo used a portion of their income from taxation of peasants to pay the samurai, usually in rice. Over time, however, the most powerful Jito and Shugo daimyo began challenging the authority of the shogun, eventually leading to the collapse of the feudal system in the 19th century. Social and economic trends. Nucleation village. Nucleation is the process by which villages become amalgamated, creating larger and more complex settlements resembling multifunctional regional hubs. Buildings were built closer to one another, with moats and walls becoming increasingly common, appearing in Japan during the 13th century. This process was accelerated by the development of more advanced agricultural technology, including double cropping and increased fertilizer use. The coalescence of medieval villages gave way to the emergence of forts and castles, often along trade routes or rivers, which served as homes for daimyos, feudal lords, and local samurai groups. The increased size of the villages and their status as economic hubs facilitated contact with outsiders. Competition over natural resources increased as commerce grew throughout Japan. As a result, peasants, artisans, and merchants, relying on farmers for food, migrated toward these agricultural sites, creating urban centers for commerce. Peasants began speaking collectively, oftentimes engaging in disputes against their social superiors. This prompted the need for improved managerial strategy, leading to self-governing organizations. Agriculture, the economy of early feudal Japan, was based almost entirely on agriculture. With rice as the basis of trade, the landowners capable of producing the most rice quickly gained political and social authority. To gain the status of daimyo, one bu to produce 10,000 koku of rice, or an equivalent form of produce. The koku is a Japanese unit of measurement equal to about 180 liters, or 5 bushels. The power of feudal lords was often directly quantified by their output in koku, rather than acreage of land ownership or military might. In fact, the amount of military service required from a vassal depended on the koku of their specific fief. Generally, a 1,000 koku fief equated to 1 mounted warrior, 2 musketmen, 1 archer, and 5 pikemen. A measurement of potential income, koku-duka, was used to rank each estate and determine the order in which they would be evaluated by the shogunal court. Stability of the Edo period. The Edo period 1603 to 1868, also known as the Tokugawa period, began when Tokugawa Ieyasu became shogun. This era is marked by urbanization, an increase in domestic commerce, and a decrease in foreign commerce toward the mid-1600s. Transportation of produce from more distant rural areas to new towns became increasingly sought after. This resulted in a system of material transport and warehousing in Kyoto. Soon, Kyoto became home to a central rice market and set prices through an auction system. The shogun held national authority while the daimyo firmly controlled the various regions across the archipelago. During this time, a clear hierarchy emerged, atop which sat the emperor, who in reality was a figurehead, followed by the shogun, daimyo, samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants at the bottom. Merchants were seen as the lowest class because they produced nothing of their own, instead profiting from the production of others. However, with the rise of construction, trades, and banking facilities, merchant associations and rice brokers prospered. These merchants coalesced their shops around Dojima, where the rice exchange was established in 1697 and where the world's first futures market would come to exist, to sell rice that was not yet harvested. Though initially against futures trading, the shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune officially authorized the use of futures contracts in 1730 after the price of rice fell sharply, threatening the samurai's income. The declining economic position of the warrior class relative to the merchant class caused anxiety amongst the ruling parties who wished to maintain their dominance, leading to decreased regulation on trading policies. The Edo period ended as Japan opened its borders to Western commerce. Nanben Trade Main article. Nanben Trade Nanban Trade was a period of international trade that began in the Sengoku period around 1543, through contact between Japanese and Portuguese explorers and merchants. Quickly, global trade routes were established, which exposed Japan to refined sugar, firearms, new shipbuilding techniques, and Christianity. Embargoes against Japan from China. Following naval clashes between the two empires had limited the supply of Chinese goods in Japan. Portugal viewed this as a profitable opportunity to act as an intermediary, since there was a high demand for Chinese goods in Japan, notably for silk yarn, which was highly sought-after commodity by the warrior classes. Similarly, the Chinese placed a high value of Japanese silver, creating a commerce market that the Portuguese were able to navigate with financial success. The civil war in Japan during the late 16th century also benefited Portuguese merchants, as daimyos competed with each other to offer more attractive trading conditions in their farms. In the late 16th and early 17th century, Japanese Red Seal ships as well as vessels from Spain, Holland, and England competed with Portuguese merchants, but Portugal still maintained a firm grasp on East Asian trade due to their prior negotiations and relationships with Chinese merchants. The period of Nanbon trade declined in the early Edo period as the Tokugawa shogunate worried about the spread of Christianity in Japan. Coinage up until the mid-13th century. Rice and sometimes silk and other types of cloth were primarily used as the medium of exchange in medieval Japan. As a result of trade expansion beginning in the 12th century, Chinese and other foreign-made coins were gaining popularity and were adopted as the preferred currency. In the late 15th century, copper coins began being distinguished by their quality, with merchants only accepting high-quality coins and rejecting coins of lower quality through a process known as schroffing or selecting coins. This process expanded as commodity trade grew and coins' demand began to exceed their supply. Schroffing created a divide in the value of coinage held by higher social classes, who had better access to high-quality coins, and lower classes, prompting anti-schroffing decrees from Japanese authorities. Chinese coins entered the Japanese market through a variety of ways and created a circulation system with no state intervention. The copper coins, which were originally denounced as a viable form of currency by the imperial court in Japan, gained value through their issuance by the Chinese court. More important to the coin's value and credibility, however, were market forces in Japan, which determined prices before the state did. What they ate, daily meals, varied widely by social rank. Commoners mostly ate katemishi, a thin, filling mix of barley, millet, daikon, and the occasional bit of rice, stark contrast to the lavish fare of the elite. Katemoshikateishi, also spelled katemashi, was a common peasant food in Japan during the Meiji and Taisho periods, 1867 to 1924. Some laborers and farmers subsisted on the dish during this time, whereas wealthier people consumed larger quantities of rice, which was a relatively expensive food compared to the income of some workers. Typical ingredients in the dish included rice, barley, millet, and chopped daikon, a mild winter radish. Variations of the dish were based upon the regional and seasonal availability of foods in different areas of Japan. Historikateshi was a rice dish, peasant food and former staple food in Japanese cuisine that was common during the Meiji and Taisho periods of Japan. During this time, rice was an expensive food for laborers, and some employers fed their workers katemishi, while feeding themselves with significantly larger quantities of rice and separate side dishes. Some farmers in rural Japan also subsisted on katemishi, whereas merchants and former samurai who lived in cities consumed larger quantities of rice. Preparation. Typical ingredients in the preparation of katemishi included rice, barley, millet, chopped daikon, radish root and leaves, and other greens. The use of daikon in the dish was very common. Various additional ingredients were also used in the dish in regional areas of Japan, based upon food availability. In the Mie prefecture of Japan, potato leaves were used in addition to daikon. Discuss in eastern Japan. White potatoes were used as an ingredient in katamishi, and in western Japan, sweet potatoes were used. Edible seaweeds, such as hijiki and wakame, were used as ingredients in coastal areas. Tofu and okara, which is a leftover pulp byproduct from tofu production, were sometimes used in katamishi. Other ingredients used in the dish in various areas of Japan, when available, included wheat, carrots, turnips, burdock, taro, pumpkin, soybeans, mushrooms, kidney beans, and adzuki beans, among others. Monks, following Buddhist principles, preferred simple vegetarian dishes like miso soup and pickled vegetables. Fish and rice were staples during festivals. This article traces the history of cuisine in Japan. Foods and food preparation by the early Japanese Neolithic settlements can be pieced together from archaeological studies, and reveals paramount importance of rice and seafood since early times. The Kofan period, 3rd to 7th centuries, is shrouded in uncertainty. Some entries in Japan's earliest written chronicles hint at a picture of food habits from the time of the formation of the imperial dynasty, when Buddhism became widely accepted. With the rise of the Soga clan, a taboo on eating meat, especially mammals, began to be enforced and became common practice, although wild game was still being taken by mountain people and would be eaten by townspeople when the opportunity arose. Treatises on ceremony, tax documents, and fiction allows one to make a list of food ingredients used and basic preparation methods in the Heian period. However, anything like recipes from the Middle Ages are a rare commodity in Japan or any country. Records throughout Middle Ages may give some idea of the dishes being enjoyed, but do not give details such as to provide accurate recipes. Once Japan entered the Edo period, there were rich records of foods and cuisine from commoners, i.e. non-samurai, who were largely literate and produced a great deal of woodblock printed literature. Early history before 794, following the Jomon period, 14,000 to 300 BCE, Japanese society shifted from semi-sedentary hunter-gatherer lifestyle to an agricultural society. This was the period in which rice cultivation began. Having been introduced by China around the 3rd century BCE, rice was commonly boiled plain and called gohan, or meshi, and, as cooked rice has since been the preferred staple of the meal, the terms are used as synonyms for the word meal. Peasants often mixed millet with rice, especially in mountainous regions where rice did not proliferate. During the Kofan period, 300 to 538 CE, Chinese culture was introduced into Japan from Korea. As such, Buddhism became influential on Japanese culture. After the 6th century, Japan directly pursued the imitation of Chinese culture of the Tang dynasty, 618 to 907. It was this influence that marked the taboos on the consumption of meat in Japan. In 675 CE, Emperor Tenmu decreed a prohibition on the consumption of cattle, horses, dogs, monkeys, and chickens during the 4th-9th months of the year. To break the law would mean a death sentence. Monkey was eaten prior to this time, but was eaten more in a ritualistic style for medicinal purposes. Chickens were often domesticated as pets, citation needed, while cattle and horses were rare and treated as such. A cow or horse would be ritually sacrificed on the first day of rice paddy cultivation, a ritual introduced from China. Emperor Tenmu's decree, however, did not ban the consumption of deer or wild boar. which were important to the Japanese diet at that time. Heian, period 794–1185. The Heian period 794 to 1185 in the 8th century saw many additional decrees made by emperors and empresses banning the killing of any animals. In Tiwu Rce, Empress Koken decreed a ban on fishing, but made a promise that adequate rice would be given to fishermen whose livelihood would have otherwise been destroyed. In 927 CE, regulations were enacted that stated that any government official or member of nobility that ate meat was deemed unclean for 3 days and could not participate in Shinto observances at the imperial court. It was also the influence of Chinese cultures through Korea that brought chopsticks to Japan early in this period. Chopsticks at this time were used by nobility at banquets. They were not used as everyday utensils, however, as hands were still commonly used to eat. Metal spoons were also used during the 8th and 9th centuries, but only by the nobility. Dining tables were also introduced to Japan at this time. Commoners used a legless table called a rushiki, while nobility used a lacquered table with legs called a zen. Each person used his own table. Lavish banquets for the nobility would have multiple tables for each individual based upon the number of dishes presented. Along with the addition of chopsticks, Chinese tea was also introduced to Japan during the Heian period, although first recorded in Japan during the Nara period 710 to 784. Tea grew popular after Buddhist monks Sacho and Kukai traveled back to Japan from China, bearing tea seeds and leaves in 805 CET, then became popular in Japanese court, and as farmers began to grow and farm tea plants around the time of 805 CE, tea began to expand in popularity. Upon the decline of the Tang dynasty in the 9th century, Japan made a move toward its individuality in culture and cuisine. The abandonment of the spoon as a dining utensil, which was retained in Korea, is one of the marked differences, and commoners were now eating with chopsticks as well. Trade continued with China and Korea, but influence en masse from outside Japan would not be seen again until the 19th century. The 10th and 11th centuries marked a level of refinement of cooking and etiquette found in the culture of the Heian nobility. Court chefs would prepare many of the vegetables sent as tax from the countryside. Court banquets were common and lavish. Garb for nobility during these events remained in the Chinese style, which differentiated them from the plain clothes of commoners. The dishes consumed after the 9th century included grilled fish and meat, yakimono, simmered food, namono, steamed foods, mushimono, soups made from chopped vegetables, fish or meat, atsumono, jellied fish, nikagori simmered with seasonings, sliced raw fish served in a vinegar sauce, namasu, vegetables, seaweed or fish in a strong dressing, and pickled vegetables, sukemono, that were cured in salt to cause lactic fermentation. Other snacks included fruit, nuts, and rice cakes, which were made with rice and different vegetables. Oil and fat were avoided almost universally in cooking. Sesame oil was used, but rarely, as it was of great expense to produce. Documents from the Heian nobility note that fish and wildfowl were common fare along with vegetables. These Heian nobles ate twice a day, once at 10 a.m. and once at 4 p.m. Their banquet settings consisted of a bowl of rice and soup, along with chopsticks, a spoon, and 3 seasonings, which were salt, vinegar, and hishio, which was a fermentation of soybeans, wheat, sake, and salt. A 4th plate was present for mixing the seasonings to desired flavor for dipping the food. The 4 types of food present at a banquet consisted of dried foods, himono, fresh foods, namamono, fermented or dressed food, kubotsuki, and desserts, kashi. Dried fish and fowl were thinly sliced, for example salted salmon, pheasant, steamed and dried abalone, dried and grilled octopus, while fresh fish, shellfish and fowl were sliced raw in vinegar sauce or grilled, for example carp, sea bream, salmon, trout, pheasant. Kubotsuki consisted of small balls of fermented sea squirt, fish or giblets, along with jellyfish and ame. Desserts would have included Chinese cakes and a variety of fruits and nuts, including pine nuts, dried chestnuts, acorns, jubei, pomegranate, peach, apricot, persimmon, and citrus. The meal would be ended with sake, kamakura, period 1192 to 1333. The Kamakura period marked a large political change in Japan. Prior to the Kamakura period, the samurai were guards of the landed estates of the nobility. The nobility, having lost control of the Japanese countryside, fell under the militaristic rule of the peasant class samurai, with a military government being set up in 1192 in Kamakura, giving way to the period. Once the position of power had been exchanged, the role of the court banquets changed. The court cuisine, which had prior to this time emphasized flavor and nutritional aspects, changed to a highly ceremonial and official role. Minamoto, the first shogun, punished other samurai who followed the earlier showy banquet style of the nobility. The shogun banquet, called uban, was attended by military leaders from the provinces. The uban originally referred to a luncheon on festival days attended by soldiers and guards during the Heian period, and was attached to the warrior class. The menu usually consisted of dried abalone, jellyfish, amono, pickled yum called umiboshi, salt and vinegar for seasoning, and rice. Later in the period, the honzan-riri banquet became popularized. The cuisine of the samurai came distinctly from their peasant roots. The meals prepared emphasized simplicity while being substantial. The cuisine avoided refinement, ceremony, and luxury, and shed all further Chinese influence. One specific example is the change from wearing traditional Chinese garb to a distinct clothing style that combined the simple clothing of the common people. This style evolved into the kimono by the end of the Middle Ages. The Buddhist vegetarian philosophy strengthened during the Kamakura period as it began to spread to the peasants, those who were involved in the trade of slaughtering animals for food or leather came under discrimination. Those practicing this trade were considered in opposition to the Buddhist philosophy of not taking life, while under the Shinto philosophy they were considered defiled. This discrimination intensified and eventually led to the creation of a separate caste. The Burakumin Zengu, Edo Meiji, and Showa Jida Jesuit Catholic Portuguese missionary João Rodrigues said that Japanese refused to eat lard, hens, duck, pigs, cow, horse, and ass, and refused to eat their own livestock and only sometimes hunted wild animals during feasts. In contrast to the Chinese, who ate geese, hens, domestic duck, bacon, lard, pork, cow, horse, and ass, Catholic Christians visiting Japan were accused of eating dogs, horses, and cattle by Japanese Buddhist monks. The book Comparison Between European and Japanese Cultures was written by Luis Frois, Iwu San A, Dao Iwu Jiu Ti, a Jesuit father in 1585. He said Europeans relish hens, quails, pies, and blancmanges. Japanese prefer wild dogs, cranes, large monkeys, cats, and uncooked seaweed for eating. We do not eat dog meat, but beef. Japanese do not eat beef but dog meat as medicine. The Japanese also ate raw, sliced boar meat, unlike Europeans who cooked it in stew. Animal milk, like cow milk, was despised and abhorred and meat eating was avoided by the Japanese in the 19th century. When one Japanese, Masukara, wanted to feed cow milk to babies after he was told Western babies were fed it, he imported from Shanghai milking equipment at the French consul's advice and purchased Nagasaki cows. He never drank it himself. Beef was not eaten as regular food in Japan until the Meiji Restoration. Meat eating was forbidden by Buddhism. In Japan, meat eating was an abhorred Western practice. According to one samurai family's daughter, who never ate meat, Shintoism and Buddhism both contributed to the vegetarian diet of medieval Japanese, while 0.1 ounces of meat was the daily amount consumed by the average Japanese in 1939. Japan lacked arable land for livestock, so meat eating was outlawed several times by Japan's rulers. In 675, a law was passed stating that from late spring to early autumn, dog, chicken, monkey, and beef meat was not allowed for that period of time. Other bans were implemented. Japan mostly got meat from hunting wild animals, but wild animals like boar and deer decreased as farmers cut down forests for farms. Since the population grew, Japan started adopting meat-based diets from Europeans like the Dutch, who were taller than them in the 18th century, and then when the Meiji Emperor ate meat in public, on the 24th of January 1872, then Japan started importing Korean beef, with a 13 times increase in Tokyo's beef consumption in 5 years. The average Japanese conscript was weak, with a minimum height at 4 feet 11 inches. 16% of conscripts were shorter than that height, and were generally thin. Japan needed to boost its army strength at the time when it was modernizing. Japan then saw American soldiers eating bacon, steaks, and hamburgers after the Second World War when America occupied Japan. Japan's McDonald's chief, Den Fujita, said, "If we eat hamburgers for 1,000 years, we will become blonde. And when we become blonde, we can conquer the world." Beef was, however, eaten as medicine in both China and Japan, as a special exemption to the ban before the 19th century. The ban originated in the 10th century noble suppers, formatted in elegant traditions like Honzen Ryori, featured multiple small dishes, grilled fish, pickles, vinegared vegetables, and were served on tiered trays in ceremonious fashion. Living conditions and sleep. Peasants and artisans lived in simple wooden homes with tatami mats or straw bedding. They slept in layered clothing to stay warm during cold nights and shared tiny rooms with multiple family members. Life followed the land. Seasonal rituals tied people to the sun and harvest. Winter nights brought the hush of snow and candles, flickering against shoji screens, a time when storytelling replaced chatter. Religion and rituals, Shinto and Buddhism, defined daily rhythms. Most villagers prayed at home or local shrines. Shinto marked events like planting and farming success, while Pure Land Buddhism promised peace beyond life's struggles. This was not a world of leisure. It was structured survival, a world woven with rice, rituals, and rigid roles. Technology was simple, comfort was rare, and every day was guided by duty, faith, and harvest. Could you cope with waking to that world 8 centuries ago? Still, among the hardships, there was beauty in ritual, unity in labor, and peace in predictable rhythms. This was life in feudal Japan.